Under the shade of Charleston's ancient oaks in St. Michael's Cemetery rest 9 graves that once belonged to the city's wealthiest plantation owners. Between 1851 and 1855, each man died in almost the same way, sudden paralysis followed by what doctors politely called a merciful death. For decades, their families avoided speaking of it. Then in 1923, during a renovation, workers uncovered something chilling. Inside those coffins, the wooden lids were clawed with frantic fingernail marks, and the bodies were twisted in positions of panic. These men hadn't gone quietly into the night, they had been buried alive. What came next only deepened Charleston's shame. Beneath an old magnolia tree lay a leather-bound journal written by Solomon Fairfax, a man whose story turned whispers of misfortune into a tale of vengeance. His entries revealed 4 years of careful planning, a journey from grief-stricken healer to Charleston's most deliberate killer. The very first line, penned on March 15, 1851, explained his transformation with devastating clarity. "Today, I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it." Charleston of the 1850s was the South's crown jewel, where fortunes built on rice and cotton gave rise to sprawling mansions along the Cooper River. Its elite relied heavily on the small but respected medical community, where one physician stood above the rest, Dr. Cornelius Hathaway. By 1845, his meeting street practice had become the place where Charleston's upper class sought exotic remedies for strange illnesses that seemed to plague their families. But much of Hathaway's reputation rested not on his own skill, but on his assistant, a slave named Solomon Fairfax. Solomon was no ordinary man in bondage. Tall, sharp-eyed, and deeply knowledgeable in healing, he had been trained in botanical medicine passed down through his family and sharpened by observing white physicians. He could read, write, and even understand the Latin terms of the trade. Wealthy patients often requested him, specifically praising his gentle touch and uncanny intuition. Before working in Charleston, Solomon had spent 32 years on the Pemberton plantation, where he lived with his wife Celia and their 3 children. His remedies had saved countless lives, slave and free alike, during deadly outbreaks of fever and disease. That rare respect he earned as a healer set him apart in a brutal world. But when fire claimed his family and left him broken, something inside Solomon shifted, and soon the men who once trusted him with their health would find themselves locked in coffins, scratching for breath as Solomon's revenge unfolded, 1 grave at a time. In the Piton household, Solomon's skills as a healer had earned him rare privileges, even tending to the master's own family when illness struck a mark of the trust he had carefully built. But in March of 1851, that fragile sense of security collapsed when Edmund Piton's gambling debts forced him to liquidate what he called assets, including human lives. The decision meant that Solomon's wife Celia and their 3 children would be sold off to different plantations across the state. For slaveholders, it was business necessity. For Solomon, it was the destruction of his world. He begged Piton for mercy, offering to work the rest of his life without pay, even proposing to hire himself out to other plantations so his wages could settle the debts. None of it mattered. Creditors were pressing, and Piton scheduled the sale for March 14th at the Charleston slave market. Nothing would change his mind. That morning broke heavy with humidity, storm clouds rolling over the Ashley River like an omen. In their cabin the night before, Solomon had held his family close, memorizing every detail. The curve of Celia's smile, the softness of his children's breathing, knowing that sunrise would tear them away. Celia, always steady, had focused on preparing the children. 8-year-old Marcus brimmed with questions about the world beyond the plantation. 6-year-old Samuel had inherited his father's gentleness and love of gathering herbs in the woods. Little Grace, only 4, clung to her mother with the instinct that something terrible was coming. When the traders arrived, Solomon watched in agony as his family was herded into a wagon with others facing the same fate. Their children's cries mixed with whispered promises to reunite one day, words everyone knew were hollow but necessary to survive the moment. Halfway to Charleston, the wagon jolted violently into a rut. Celia was thrown onto the road, striking her head on a jagged stone. Blood pooled as Solomon, chained, fought to reach her. The traders looked her over coldly, declared her a loss, and pressed forward. Solomon screamed as they left her behind, but the others restrained him, knowing resistance meant death. At the slave market, the nightmare only deepened. He was forced to watch as his children were sold off one by one. Marcus went to a rice planter in Georgetown, notorious for using children in the swamps. Samuel was taken by a cotton grower from the upcountry with a reputation for working people into the grave. Grace, still too young for field labor, was bought as a house servant by a Savannah family, vanishing into a life Solomon would never see. Outwardly, he showed no emotion. Survival demanded silence. Inwardly, something in him snapped. The man who had lived to heal, to preserve life, now felt only the cold certainty that he must one day balance the scales. Dr. Cornelius Hathaway, seeking an assistant with rare medical knowledge, purchased Solomon for a high price. The physician knew of his skills from whispers among other doctors and saw in him a valuable partner. As Solomon was led away, he cast one final look back at the place where his family had been torn apart. In that moment, grief hardened into patience, a patient hatred that would allow him to wait to study and to exact justice with precision. That night, in the small room above Dr. Hathaway's practice, Solomon lit a candle and opened the leather journal he had kept hidden. His careful handwriting filled the page with words that would define the rest of his life. A vow born of loss, a promise that the men who had destroyed his family would one day feel his hand close around their fate. Today, I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. Yet I remain alive, carrying every face, every name, every mocking voice in my memory. They believe they've crushed me, but all they've done is sharpen my patience. Their lesson will be repaid in full. The months after Solomon's arrival at Dr. Hathaway's practice slipped by in a rhythm of treatments, prescriptions, and patient visits. Outwardly, Solomon was the same careful, dependable assistant, mixing tonics, steadying trembling hands, during procedures, preparing rooms with quiet precision. Dr. Hathaway, aging and plagued with arthritis, leaned on him more each week, granting him responsibilities that most men in bondage could never dream of. Charleston's elite, at first dismissive, slowly came to trust him, some even requesting his presence above the doctors. To them, he was an unusually skilled servant. To Solomon, it was the perfect disguise. Beneath the mask of obedience, he was waging a different campaign. Every patient's story, every whispered complaint, every careless remark about money or family became a piece of intelligence. He traced business dealings, mapped social alliances, and most importantly, tracked the men whose fortunes were tied to the slave market that had ripped his family apart. By listening carefully to the idle chatter of wealthy patients and through quiet conversations with house slaves in Charleston's mansions, Solomon built a private dossier of the city's most powerful men. What he discovered cut deeper than even his worst suspicions. Edmund Peaton, the man who had sold his wife and children, was not a lone betrayer, but part of a web of respectable gentlemen who profited from the auction block. They were men of influence, church elders, patrons of the arts, men toasted at banquets for their refinement. Yet they financed dealers who specialized in breaking families, or sat in the market themselves, bidding on human lives with the same detachment used for livestock. Among Hathaway's patients, Solomon identified 9 who had touched his tragedy directly. Some had stood in the crowd when his children were sold. Others had bankrolled the traders who abandoned Celia bleeding by the roadside. A few had purchased flesh from that very auction, scattering his bloodline across the South. As he quietly documented their names, another education began. Dr. Hathaway's shelves were lined with medical texts detailing the properties of exotic compounds. Substances capable of inducing paralysis, deep sleep, or even the illusion of death, while leaving the victim's mind horrifically alert. Intended for healing, these books became Solomon's manuals in a darker discipline. Each formula, each case study, each carefully recorded experiment turned his grief into a curriculum. By the end of 1852, Solomon was no longer simply an assistant healer. He was an apprentice in vengeance, preparing to deliver a punishment as methodical and unforgiving as the system that had destroyed his family. The breakthrough came in an old treatise on South American plant toxins that described a vine from the Amazon whose extract could freeze the body in complete muscular paralysis while leaving the mind painfully aware, a poison that made the living look dead to anyone who glanced and mourned. Solomon learned that the very vine had been grown by a Charleston botanist who supplied exotic specimens to the wealthy, and through patient inquiry, he traced it to Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw at the College of Charleston, a man who welcomed Solomon into his greenhouse because he loved plants and thought he had found a kindred spirit. Under that excuse, Solomon learned how to identify, tend, and propagate the plant, then turned to careful experiments on lab mice until he found the razor edge between too little, which sapped strength but let victims recover, and too much, which killed outright. Discovering the precise dose that would mimic death while keeping awareness and suffering intact long enough for burial to be a true torment. Preparing to use that knowledge demanded a different discipline than the chemistry itself. Solomon kept his calm, his gentle bedside manner, rehearsed his helpful smiles, and wrote the names of his children in his journal until grief sharpened into a cold patience. By winter of 1852, he had chosen his first target, Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, a rice planter who had laughed at the auction that scattered Solomon's family, and who visited Dr. Hathaway monthly for gout treatments, always alone and always trusting Solomon. The colonel's regular schedule, his reliance on the practice, and the way he let his guard down made him the perfect first victim. Solomon cataloged 9 men in his journal, like case notes listing illnesses, appointment times, and each man's role in the slave trade, and he spent 1852 turning himself into the indispensable assistant Hathaway needed. Arriving earlier, staying later, taking more responsibility, and setting up a small shed behind the office as a legitimate workspace for herbal remedies, while he cultivated the vine and refined his extraction methods, planning every contingency, because the men he targeted were pillars of Charleston society, and any mistake would draw scrutiny he could not afford. The work was perilous. More than once, Solomon accidentally exposed himself to trace amounts of the toxin, his limbs going numb, his chest tightening in a way that gave him a dreadful glimpse of the fate he intended for others. Still, he pressed on until he had perfected a preparation so subtle it was almost invisible, a colorless, odorless liquid that blended seamlessly into any medication. Within half an hour of ingestion, the victim would feel weak, confused, and convinced it was merely their ailment worsening. After an hour, paralysis would take hold so completely that even the most attentive physician of the 1850s would mistake it for death. Breathing became imperceptible. The pulse nearly vanished, and the body lay cold and still, while inside the mind remained alive, screaming silently. Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick was the perfect candidate for Solomon's first strike. He had mocked Solomon's family at the auction, his cruel jokes about breeding stock seared into memory. He lived alone, his slaves too terrified to question his end. and his long-documented heart condition gave Solomon the perfect medical alibi. If Fitzpatrick collapsed, every doctor in Charleston would assume it was heart failure. No one would dig deeper. On December 15, 1852, Fitzpatrick limped into Dr. Hathaway's office, wincing from another bout of gout. The doctor was with another patient and waved Solomon forward. "Prepare the usual treatment," he said unknowingly, handing Solomon the moment he had waited nearly 2 years to seize. Solomon mixed the remedy with practiced ease, steady hands adding measured drops of the toxin. He carried it over calm as ever, and Fitzpatrick swallowed it without hesitation. At first, the colonel grumbled about his pain as usual. Then his words faltered. His fingers trembled. A haze dulled his eyes. Solomon sat beside him, voice as soft and professional as always. "Colonel Fitzpatrick," he began, "my name is Solomon Fairfax. You destroyed my family at the Charleston slave market on March 14, 1851. You laughed when my children were sold. You joked about their worth. Do you remember?" The colonel's eyes widened as the realization struck. His lips strained to move, but no sound came. The paralysis was taking hold, locking his body while his mind screamed. Solomon leaned closer, his voice steady, almost compassionate. "You're not dying yet. The medicine I gave you has silenced your body, but your mind is clear. In less than an hour, the doctor will declare you dead of heart failure. Tomorrow, you'll be buried in St. Michael's Cemetery. But you won't actually die until long after the coffin is sealed. You'll hear the shovels feel the earth, and you'll have hours to think about the children you condemned." By the time paralysis was complete, Fitzpatrick looked every bit the corpse. His chest barely stirred, his pulse so faint it was invisible to 19th century medicine. Yet Solomon saw the frantic awareness in his eyes, the terror trapped behind glass. Moments later, Dr. Hathaway entered. He glanced at the still body, felt quickly for a pulse, and sighed. The colonel's heart finally gave out. Solomon bowed his head, his expression suitably grave. "Yes, doctor," he said quietly. "He passed while I was preparing his treatment. He seemed to go very peacefully, and when Dr. Hathaway confirmed what Solomon already knew, the colonel was taken home and a proper funeral was arranged." Solomon stood with the other slaves as Fitzpatrick's coffin sank into the earth and felt a cold, empty satisfaction rather than triumph. Then that night he wrote in his journal, "Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes. 8 remain just as his patient, but certain, and he waited with a terror that was almost prayer to see if his method would draw notice." Charleston went on with its condolences and toasts. Doctors traded the usual explanations, and for a time, no one asked the questions Solomon feared. But the act left him shaken in ways he had not expected. Sleep slipping from him as he imagined the hours Fitzpatrick must have spent aware and immobile beneath the soil. Choosing the next target became an exercise in politics and timing. And he settled on Judge Marcus Calverton, a man whose rulings had lent the machinery of law to the breaking of families, and whose frequent visits for crippling migraines gave Solomon a plausible medical script, yet just as he was ready to set the next phase in motion, the practice announced a change that threatened everything Dr. Hathaway was considering a junior partner, a young physician freshly returned from Philadelphia who brought new eyes and modern training. And Solomon realized his leisurely timetable had collapsed into a desperate sprint. He would have to finish what he began before the new doctor could notice patterns or question oddities, and that pressure forced him to take greater risks. In April of 1853, while preparing what he thought was the exact dose for Judge Calverton, Solomon miscalculated a fraction too strong, and the result was immediate and brutal. The judge convulsed and fell so quickly that there was no slow, convincing imitation of natural decline. Hathaway and the new doctor rushed in, hands and faces trained by years of practice. And though Solomon covered his part with a face of shock and carefully chosen words, he felt the thin thread of disguise fray. Dr. Henderson asked direct questions about recent medications and noted that the usual signs of a migraine turning into stroke were absent. A remark Solomon smoothed over with technical terms and a quiet apology. But the mistake lodged like a stone in his chest, a reminder that the margin for error was thinner than he had believed, and that with a new pair of eyes in the practice, he would have to become more cunning, more creative, and far colder than he already was. The judge's death played out faster and stranger than Solomon expected. And when Dr. Hathaway probed the body, he muttered that the muscle rigidity seemed harsher than a typical stroke. And there was something almost pleading in the eyes, a detail that made Solomon's heart pound, as the physician examined Calverton far more closely than he had Fitzpatrick. For a terrifying stretch of minutes, Solomon feared exposure, but Hathaway, skilled for his era, lacked the specific knowledge to spot the effects of Solomon's exotic toxin. And after a careful check, he chalked the odd signs up to a severe cerebrovascular event, pitying the man's suffering, even as Judge Calverton lay fully conscious and immobilized beneath that same verdict. The judge's funeral drew an even larger crowd than the colonel's, and while Solomon stood in the slave section watching the coffin lower into St. Michael's Cemetery, he spotted a young man at the back, scribbling notes in a leather memorandum book. Thomas Grimby of the Charleston Mercury, who had begun tracking what he called the prominent deaths phenomenon. A string of sudden fatalities among the city's elite that, taken together, began to look suspicious. That evening, Solomon wrote in his journal that Calverton had paid for his crimes, but that others were noticing, and he admitted he must speed up his work, even if it meant more risk. Forced to compress his timetable, Solomon chose Captain William Dandridge next, a shipowner who had overseen the transport of human cargo, and who did not visit the practice on a schedule, so Solomon needed to manufacture his chance. Through the network of kitchen and household slaves, he learned that Dandridge planned a dinner for Charleston's shipping men on May 20th, 1853, an event that would gather the right people in one house and provide the opening Solomon required. The dinner gave Solomon exactly what he needed: cover access and a room full of men who had helped build his grief into profit, so he slipped into the kitchens through Martha, an elderly cook who welcomed his help when fever had thinned her staff, and moved among silver and crystal topping off glasses, clearing plates and listening as Captain Dandridge boasted about voyages, cargo, and the tricks of keeping human freight alive on long trips. His talk revealing the casual cruelty behind Charleston wealth. Thomas Grimby, the Mercury reporter, kept poking at the edges of the story by mapping burials and medical histories, and Solomon knew the journalist's notes could unravel everything. So he used the party not only to strike, but to gather names for future retribution, watching faces and recording alliances as he worked. When the final course came, a brandy-soaked cake prepared individually for each guest. Solomon moved quietly in the kitchen, slipping the paralytic into Dandridge's portion the way a skilled hand masks spice, knowing alcohol would carry the compound with no hint of taste. And when the captain praised Martha and asked for the recipe, Solomon watched him eat with the same steady calm he showed at every bedside, feeling the years of planning tighten into a single terrible moment. He waited in the alley until the lamplight died to a pale glow, then slipped in with a duplicate key and found his 6 targets frozen around the mahogany table. Every muscle locked eyes frantically following his steps as if pleading for rescue. They could not call for. And for a long, terrible minute, Solomon simply moved among them, noting the exact expression on each face, the way terror sharpened into something like understanding, And then with the same clinical calm he had used for years, he checked pulses that were all but undetectable to 19th century hands. Closed their lids as a man who had learned to hide the truth and left the scene arranged to look like a sudden, inexplicable catastrophe. He documented everything in the hidden journal he carried, writing not in triumph, but with a hollow steadiness. 6 more men had been taken from the world that traded in his family, and with them the last of the purchasers who had torn his children apart. He watched from the shadows as the city reacted. The panic, the rushed inquiries, the chorus of physicians, baffled by a new and cruel pattern, and Thomas Grimby's investigation grew louder, a small, insistent noise at the edge of the crimes he had engineered. The work had given him what he sought, and it had cost him more than he imagined. Sleep never returned the same way, and the faces of those men haunted him as persistently as the faces of his lost wife and children. Before dawn, he buried the leather journal beneath the magnolia on the practice's grounds, covering it with earth and writing a final entry that read, like both confession and epitaph, "Justice had been done, 9 had been returned to the dirt that had taken his peace." And now he would disappear into the life of a healer again, until history either forgave him or forgot him. Solomon met Grimby face to face, calm and clinical as ever, as he walked the room and told each man exactly what awaited them. And for a long moment the 2 men held the story between them. One a man who had watched his family burned and sold, and turned that grief into a precise, terrible justice. The other a reporter who wanted the truth, but could not help feeling the pull of a larger outrage. And when Grimby quietly asked if Solomon understood that continuing would mean capture or the gallows, he also offered a way out a back stair, and a few hours before the world outside closed in. Solomon listened the weight of his losses in every measured word, and though he had steeled himself for the end, he surprised them both by taking the escape Grimby proposed, not because he had found mercy, but because his work was not yet finished, and fading away now would let him finish what he had started on his own terms. So Grimby turned, pretending not to have seen the man slip into the dark, and Solomon slipped through alleys and side streets until he reached the safety of a friendly household, where he spent the small hours writing one more entry and tucking the leather journal into a place he trusted. A magnolia on the practice grounds, then he walked back into the life of the healer. A ghost among the living, while Charleston buzzed with questions and fear, and the mercury kept pressing at the edges of the truth. "I'm not running," Solomon said, his voice steady, almost serene. "Let them come. Let them see what I've done. Maybe when this story spreads, others will understand that even slaves have limits to what they'll endure in silence." The footsteps drew closer, echoing up the stairwell, and Thomas Grimby, the only man who truly understood what was about to unfold, chose the role of witness over participant. He would not save Solomon. He would preserve the story. The constables burst through the door to find 6 of Charleston's most prominent men frozen in grotesque stillness around a polished table, their eyes wide with terror, but their bodies lifeless to every conventional examination. Beside them stood Solomon Fairfax, hands folded calm as a man greeting guests. He did not resist. Instead, he offered a clear and detailed confession, explaining how he had selected his victims, cultivated the toxin, and carried out his revenge with the precision of a physician writing case notes. His words, transcribed by the constables and preserved in Charleston's archives, unraveled nearly 2 years of mysterious deaths that had haunted the city's elite. The trial that followed was unlike any Charleston had ever seen. District Attorney Charles Rutledge treated it as straightforward. A slave who had murdered 9 citizens must hang for the sake of order. But court-appointed attorney Benjamin Crawford, though unwilling at first, shaped his defense around a radical argument that Solomon's crimes could not be separated from the system that had first destroyed him. In measured tones, he forced the courtroom to hear about the mechanics of Charleston's slave trade. The splitting of families, the auctions where children were sold like cattle, the legal rulings that sanctified cruelty as economic necessity. Solomon himself described the night he watched his wife bleed by the roadside, his children torn from his arms, and the cold silence of men who called themselves civilized. Thomas Grimby's reporting electrified the South. His articles for the Charleston Mercury blended courtroom drama with excerpts from Solomon's journal, detailing both the science of the paralytic compound and the raw grief that had driven its use. Newspapers from Virginia to Louisiana reprinted the story of a slave who had turned knowledge meant for healing into a weapon of vengeance. Among planters, it became a tale whispered with fear-proof that beneath the enforced silence of bondage, there was rage waiting for an opening. The scientific dimensions of Solomon's case became as infamous as the murders themselves. Dr. Hathaway, shaken to his core, testified that the man he had trusted most in his practice had turned medical skill into a weapon. His account made headlines not just for the betrayal, but for what it revealed, that an enslaved man had mastered advanced chemistry, toxicology, and the careful use of exotic botanicals. Southern elites recoiled at the implication. If a slave could outwit the most respected physicians in Charleston, what did that mean for the supposed intellectual hierarchy upon which their entire system rested? Debates flared about whether educating the enslaved was dangerous, while abolitionist voices seized on the case as proof of both intelligence and agency long denied. The 6 survivors from the Henderson meeting provided testimony so haunting that it eclipsed all legal arguments. Their voices carried the weight of living death. Colonel Harrison Vance's account was the most devastating. He described lying paralyzed, hearing his wife sob over his corpse, unable to move an eyelid while burial plans were whispered in the room. Others spoke of hearing prayers for their soul servants, preparing clothes for their funerals, and the terrible realization that they were trapped inside their own bodies. Those testimonies spread terror far beyond Charleston, for they confirmed what everyone now suspected: Fitzpatrick, Calverton, and Dandridge had not died peacefully. They had gone into the ground aware, awake, and suffocating. Across the South, suspicion infected every burial. Families demanded exhumations, doctors were pressured to perform post-mortem examinations, and the medical community found itself overwhelmed. Ordinary deaths now carried the shadow of doubt. Whispered fears spread from plantation to plantation. What if Uncle Thomas or Aunt Mary had not truly been dead? When the coffin closed, Solomon's vengeance had outlived him, lingering in the paranoia of every funeral. Through it all, Solomon remained calm. His testimony in court was clear, precise, and devoid of remorse. He regretted only that 3 of his intended victims still lived. His final statement cut to the marrow of the South's conscience. I was trained to preserve life and ease suffering. But when this society destroyed my family while calling it legal and proper, I learned that the same knowledge used to heal can also be used to ensure justice. I do not ask for mercy because none was given to my wife and children. I ask only that when you condemn me, you remember that I did not create the system that made such revenge necessary. The jury needed less than an hour to deliver its verdict: guilty on all counts, death by hanging. On October 15, 1853, Charleston's gallows drew an unprecedented crowd of more than 2,000 people. Some came in fear, others in fascination, a few in grim respect. When the trapdoor fell, Solomon Fairfax's body swung as a criminal. Yet in the minds of many, especially those who whispered about him for years afterward. He died as something more complex. A healer turned avenger, a man who forced the South to confront the terror at the heart of its own system. On the gallows, Solomon's voice carried the same calm certainty that had marked every step of his grim journey. I die, knowing that 9 men experienced the terror my children felt when they were sold away from everything they loved. That knowledge makes my death worthwhile. But this system that creates such desperation will continue, and other families will suffer as mine did. When that happens, remember that even the most patient man has limits to what he will endure in silence. Within moments, the trap fell, and Charleston's most notorious figure swung into history. His body was buried in an unmarked grave outside the city, forbidden consecrated ground by law. But his journal, a chilling blueprint of vengeance, did not vanish with him. Thomas Grimby, the journalist who had chronicled the case, secretly copied its contents and later buried the original beneath a magnolia in St. Michael's Cemetery, not far from the very men whose graves Solomon had filled. In his 1889 memoirs, Grimby explained, "I could not destroy the record of such methodical revenge, but I also could not allow it to inspire others." Perhaps in another age with different eyes, people will understand the terrible necessity that drove Solomon Fairfax to become both healer and killer. That hidden record resurfaced in 1923 when cemetery renovations uncovered 9 coffins scarred with desperate fingernail marks. The discovery confirmed Grimby's account in horrifying detail. But Charleston's leaders quickly sealed the files. Officially, it was about maintaining public order. Unofficially, it was about protecting old names, old fortunes, and old lies. The legacy of Solomon Fairfax rippled far beyond Charleston. Southern lawmakers cracked down on enslaved people's access to books, medical training, and science, fearing that knowledge itself had become a weapon. His case also pushed American medicine forward, sparking new forensic methods to detect toxins and advancing the science of post-mortem examinations. But perhaps the most unsettling impact was psychological. If a man like Solomon, educated, trusted, respected, could transform into such a patient avenger, what might be stirring in the hearts of millions still enslaved? This story forces us to confront a haunting question. Was Solomon's revenge justice born of desperation, or did his methods simply mirror the cruelty he sought to punish? His tale reminds us that the past does not stay buried. It waits beneath the soil in journals, in coffins, clawed from the inside, ready to rise when someone dares to uncover it. So what do you think? Was Solomon Fairfax justified, or did he cross a line that no man should share? Your thoughts below. And if you want more stories that drag America's hidden truths back into the light, subscribe, hit the bell, and pass this tale on to someone who isn't afraid to dig into the darker corners of history. Until next time, remember what lies beneath is never really gone.